Alrighty. Alright, so today we are starting the first class on Eastern religions. And we're going to be looking at one major religion, one related religion to that major religion, and then two offshoots. So we're going to be looking at Hinduism primarily today. We're going to spend most of our time looking at Hinduism, and we're going to be using all our time, if not maybe a little more today, because there's a lot of material to cover. Looking at Hinduism, and then a related religion, which is Zoroastrianism, which some people have never even heard of, or some people have heard of and don't really know what it's all about. So we're going to look at that today. And then we're going to look at, that's a related religion, you'll see why. And then we're going to look at Jainism, which is one that very few people have ever heard of.
Never heard of that.
But it's actually got quite a few people in it. And then Sikhism, which you may not have heard of, or you may think you've heard of, but you'll definitely be familiar with it when we start talking about it. Which is actually a very large religion. But Jainism and Sikhism are offshoots of Hinduism, and then Zoroastrianism is sort of related it's kind of a cousin to it. But we'll take a look at it. And then next week we're going to get into Buddhism and some of the Chinese religions and Shinto. And then after that we're going to get into the cults, the non-traditional, Jehovah's Witness, Mormonism, Christian Science, Scientology, all that fun stuff. So, but today let's get started with Hinduism. Has its origins in North India at about 1500 BC. A lot of Indian scholars have tried to make it a lot older, tried to prove that its beginning. My battery died. Sorry, I got on the video. Let's pull it off there. Tried to prove its beginning around 3000 BC in the Indus River civilization, which is basically the Indus River kind of divides India from Pakistan. But basically that area is Pakistan today, and Pakistan is filled with ideas from ancient Mesopotamia and not really Hindu ideas. And we're going to see that this religion sort of came from what is often called Indo-European, from ancient Mesopotamia, from sort of southeastern Europe, around this time, around 1500 BC. There's no real founder. There's no unifying philosophy or tradition. It evolved as a mingling of several religious influences, historical religious influences, that were not compatible with one another. In about 1500 BC, there was a group called the Aryans that came in through Afghanistan and Turkmenistan, and so that's southeastern Europe, and then sort of from the Mesopotamian area. And these Aryans sort of had a 1,000-year-long conquest or invasion or basically just a migration into that area. And they brought their culture and their religion into that region. And it started mingling in with the local religions. In Iran, the Aryans came down, and some went into India and some went into Iran. And when they went into Iran, it sort of evolved into Zoroastrianism. We're going to talk about that later today. When they migrated into India, it evolved into Hinduism. While there's no founders, and it's a religion that we're going to find gets very complicated even to define, because there are no rules, as well as a couple of rules, but the whole point of Hinduism is that not to have rules, is that It's very open. It embraces really all kinds of thought. So it gets very, and it evolves, it changes. You know, as people along the way, as the people of that area begin to sort of change their philosophies or their outlooks as to how their beliefs were looking, well, then Hinduism sort of changed with it. And on an essential level, not just sort of culturally, or it made it look a little different than the way they practice. I mean, they just really essentially changed it. However, changed it in a way that you didn't necessarily have to abandon the previous version of it, because that's just sort of the nature of Hinduism. No founders, but there have been some influential historical figures. Adi Shankara, and this is much later on, this is 788 to 820, was considered the greatest philosopher of Hinduism. He refined the earlier pantheism into a philosophy known as Advaita Vedanta, or monism. And we're going to get into that in a minute, that's why I'm bringing him up here. Because monism is sort of the underlying foundation of where Hinduism came from. Its type of pantheism. Because in monism, God is totally impersonal and without attributes. The Alvar saints of South India, again, kind of picked up right around the end of Adi Shankara. Some of the most important founders of what we're going to find out is the Bhakti, or devotional schools of Hinduism, which is, we're going to find out that Hinduism went through 3 phases. And its final phase is what we kind of see today, which is the Bhakti form of Hinduism. Although, like I said, the 2 previous phases were not necessarily replaced, they just have now become different aspects of Hinduism. Where in Bhakti Hinduism, worshiping God as a supreme being, or one or more of the manifestations of God, such as Rama or Krishna, this philosophy was the opposite of Shankara's impersonal monism. Shankara, his form of Hinduism was more pantheistic, more impersonal. When the Bhakti devotional school of Hinduism started taking on form, it sort of merged polytheism with pantheism to get kind of what we have today.
Is that kind of like the panentheism?
No, because in panentheism, God still is transcendent in his being to some degree. And he's sort of coming alongside, he's not finished yet, he's growing along with the universe. In pantheism, in this form of pantheism, it's still pantheism. It's still God is one with his creation. God is one, there is one being. But we see in the Bhakti that there is sort of a desire to have devotion, and it's difficult to have devotion toward an impersonal God. So they choose manifestations of this being. The manifestations of Brahman come in different gods. And then those different gods have manifestations within themselves that are called avatars, and we're going to learn more about that too. So it's sort of a blend of polytheism, but not really polytheism, because they're not truly gods in their own right. They're part of Brahman.
Okay, I was just going to try and follow up with that about how, like, in the Baha'i religion, they called, like, the 9 religious leaders the prophets. They said they were just manifestations of God. So, but that was panentheism. I guess I'll have to look into it and see how it really breaks apart.
Well, where they separate is in their concept of the essence of God. And when we get to monism, we're going to get to monism in a minute, you'll see where they separate, because with the Baha'i, they believe that there is a God. That there is, they are not monotheistic, but they believe there is a transcendent being out there. So it's sort of a combination of pantheism and monotheism. Because their God is sort of, coming alongside, but he's unknowable because in the Baha'i faith, it's okay, because all faiths are acceptable anyway. So they're also very, very pluralistic. With 330 million gods today, at least, within Hinduism. In the Vedas, that we're going to learn about, the Vedas are sort of the original writings that sort of lay out what Hinduism is. It is their Bible, if you will, but it is a compilation of scriptures. In those Vedas, there are 33 gods mentioned. But that has grown to over 330. And most Hindus worship multiple gods. And in the Hindu philosophy, because Hinduism almost isn't even a theology. It's really more of a philosophy. There are good gods and there are malicious gods. The good gods are called devas, and the malicious gods are called asuras. And we're going to find out in Zoroastrianism that it is reversed. That the devas, because remember they have the same roots, the devas are actually the evil gods, and the ahuras are the good gods. When they began sort of breaking up these gods, and we have the 330 million gods, several gods sort of rose to the surface as significant. Shiva and Vishnu, in particular, are two that are considered monotheistic in some forms of Hinduism, where, in other words, it's monotheistic in practice, not necessarily monotheistic in ideology. In other words, they just elevate Shiva and Vishnu as the greatest of the gods, and they will only worship them. It's not to say that they are not still pantheistic, because they still believe that Shiva and Vishnu are sort of manifestations of Brahman. But there are other deities, include Kali, Durga, Shakti, Krishna, Rama, Ganesh, and Hanuman. Here we have the most sacred writings in Hinduism. The major sacred writings of the Vedas, the 4 Vedas. There are hundreds of Hindu scriptures, but the most important ones are called the Vedas. This is what makes Hinduism Hinduism. There are 2 things that these are basically the 2 rules within Hinduism. Is number 1, in order to still be considered part of Hinduism, you must believe the Vedas. You must accept the Vedas as inspired. You also have to adhere to the caste system.
Inspired by who?
Inspired, that actually, beyond inspired, they believe that the Vedas are divine in themselves.
Do we know who wrote them?
No, they were compilations over the years. There was no, specific writers. They were just sort of things that were written down. It wasn't a unitary work, but more of compilations. The Rig Veda is just a list of prayerful hymns. The Yajurveda is mantras, short verses that are recited by the priests. The Samavedas are songs and chants also used by the priests. And the Atharva Veda is considered less reliable or inferior to the other ones, which is interesting because they consider them all divine, but somehow this is inferiorly divine. It has magic spells, incarnations. It's more of a folk religion. Okay, and each Brahmin priest specializes in one of the 4 Vedas. He memorizes them. He's responsible for everything and all the associated commentaries and rituals that have to do with them. These are some other writings. And again, this is where, Hinduism gets very confusing, because some consider these writings as part of the Vedas, and others consider these as sort of commentaries and supplements to the Vedas. The Brahmanas is just texts of rituals and mantras, again, having to do with priestly practices. The Upanishads are philosophical works. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this, any of these, the Dharma Shastras have to do with moral living, civil and criminal law, and includes what's called the laws of, or the code of Manu, which within the code of Manu, excuse me, you have the caste system spelled out very explicitly. The caste system is talked about in the Vedas, but in the code of Manu, it is really spelled out and explained what the caste system means and how it's to be carried out in practice. And we're going to talk about that in 1 minute. Then we have the Brahma Sutras, cryptic descriptions on God, reality and salvation, and other matters. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata. These are epic poems, and in the Mahabharata it includes what's called the Bhagavad Gita, which is probably the best known work of Hindu theology, which is actually just a story. It's a poem, but it's in the poem it sort of relates the story of a warrior who was about to do battle with someone that was related to him. They were part of his own family, and he was having a crisis of it, and he didn't know what to do. So his chariot driver turned around, and his chariot driver's name was Vishnu. And, I'm sorry, not Vishnu, Krishna. And claimed to be an avatar or a manifestation of the Lord Vishnu. And began speaking to him and telling him, well, look, you are of the warrior class. It is your responsibility in your caste to do battle. And regardless of what the outcome is, this is your place in life, and you have a responsibility to do this. And so he encouraged him to do it, and he went out and won the battle. And there's lots of philosophical principles that are sort of taught along the way, but that's basically the Bhagavad Gita, which has become a very important piece of scripture, particularly, literature, particularly with the, what we call the Hare Krishnas, which we're going to learn about too today. They're sort of a branch of Hinduism. And then we have the Puranas, which contains the history of the universe. Isn't that convenient? I always wanted to know the history of the universe. Interesting how they can contain that in one piece of scripture. And then the Tantras, containing magical occult rituals and spiritual exercise to accelerate enlightenment. The Tantras is all about kind of working yourself up and getting yourself excited. And that's why, we hear things about tantric exercises having to do with sexual behavior, things like that, because it's all about whipping yourself up and getting yourself excited. So it's kind of a, I don't want to use the word charismatic, but if you know what I mean, that sort of form of Hinduism. Quickly just want to go through monism. Don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because it kind of like, it's weird. In one sense, it seems really deep, and then you realize it's not that deep at all. It just doesn't make any sense. But this is the argument of monism. Okay, it kind of goes, and it's just sort of put in this way. Step one: there cannot be more than one thing. That's the conclusion. And you should always be suspicious with any argument that begins with a conclusion. Because it's saying, look, we have a conclusion here, and we're going to try to find a way to prove it. There cannot be more than one thing. That is absolute monism. If there were two things or more, they would have to differ. Okay, now, I'm okay with that. If there were two more things, if there are actually two or more things, they would have to differ. Here's where it starts getting bizarre. For the things to differ, they must differ by either being or not being. Now, there's already assumption there. You know, it's what's called begging the question. It's using your conclusion to make your own argument. It's saying that the only way that things can really differ is if they differ by either being or not being. Because if they are being, then they're the same. If they exist, then they are the same. Okay? And since they both, if you had two things and they both have being, then that makes them identical. But if they differ by non-being, then non-being is nothing, and they differ by nothing, which is not to differ at all. So it sort of has a ring of like, wow, that's really deep, but it really doesn't make any sense. You know, but it arrives at this conclusion that there cannot be more than one being, plurality of being, only one single indivisible being, rigid monism, which is saying there is that all things are basically just manifestations of one actual being. There is only one being in the universe, and we are all part of that one being, and we're not really different. And we're going to see how that sort of plays out in Hinduism. But this is sort of the basis of where this pantheism sort of, builds on. That there is only one being. This was put out by a man named Parmenides. Probably pronouncing that wrong. Around the same time that Malachi the prophet in the Old Testament was writing, he was in Italy, studied under Xenophanes, and some people think that he actually met Socrates in Greece when he was younger. He actually ended up, because he had involvements in politics, actually drew up laws for the city that he was living in, and he employed his laws of logic and used them to defend monism, which his laws of logic, in my opinion, are pretty faulty. Because, the problem is, again, it begs the question, that when you say, nor on the other hand can they differ by non-being, for non-being is nothing, and to differ by nothing is not to differ at all. It's circular reasoning. He's assuming what he's trying to prove. And he's also assuming that all beings are the same. We understand that there are spiritual beings. There are physical beings, there are spiritual beings. There is a divine being, and we have an understanding in Christianity that God is a different being than us. He is essentially, ontologically, in his essence, in his makeup, he is not us. And that there are multiple beings, that there are angelic beings, that there are demonic beings. And that and this actually gets carried over into human constitution, because, we also believe that even in ourselves, we have some separate being. We have a spiritual identity, but we also have a physical identity. But there is monism also in that says there is no difference between the spiritual and the physical. That the two are tied together inseparably. And that it's just all one being. But this idea and again, he assumes a univocal concept of God, meaning that God is is more than just identical to us. He is essentially and entirely the same as us. That there is only one being in the universe, and we are all just part of that one being. So, keeping that in mind as we sort of get back into Hinduism, the three major phases we look at, it's chronological. They appear chronological, but they sort of become three separate threads, the three ways of Hinduism. And we start with the way of works, right at the beginning of Hinduism, 1500. And this is the development and the adherence to the Vedas. Again, the laws of Manu are written around the same time. Ritual legal requirements administered by the professional priesthood. This is also called Brahmanism. or Vedic, because it really focuses on the Vedas. This is when the majority of the Vedas were written, and it's all about adhering to the Vedas and about the priestly rituals, the priestly preeminence of Hinduism. Now, about 500 BC, it grew into the way of knowledge because out of sort of a revolt against the priesthood. It was a sort of a mystical understanding. It went beyond just adherence to ritual and ceremony to saying, look, it's not about what we do, it's about what we think and what we know, and about developing our understanding about the universe and about who Brahman is and about reality. And it sort of grew into this recognition of Atman Brahman, which we're going to talk about in a minute. The emphasis was on the Upanishads, which were commentaries to the Vedas or supplements to the Vedas. This is also called Vedantic Hinduism, because it means it's sort of associated with the Vedas, but it's not directly about just teaching the Vedas. It's about taking everything that we learn from the Vedas, but then sort of internalizing it and developing a knowledge of reality. And then 200 BC to 800 AD is what's called the way of devotion, which eventually became what we know today as Bhakti Hinduism, which is the predominant form of Hinduism today, which is what they do is they sort of, now it develops from this knowledge of reality to attaching oneself to one or more god or goddesses in a devotional way. So you give your devotion to the universe, to reality, by giving your devotion to by choosing one or more specific gods that you're going to show your devotion to. Again, because these are not so much gods in their own right, in the sense of polytheism, but that they are manifestations of that one being that exists. But they are manifestations that are on a higher plane than us, a more enlightened plane than us, so that's why they are worthy of worship and veneration. The emphasis is on the Bhagavad Gita. Yep.
I'll go back just a quick second.
Sure.
You said they were on a higher plane, but they're not. When they say the gods, do they believe they're actual gods that are beings, that are all part of the larger pantheistic God? Or do they even believe that these are beings at all? They are beings, but they are all still part of the one being. But okay, they're beings, but they're different from us, but they can't be different based on their definition of monism.
Well, but we're going to get to that in a minute, because it's not, they are, now what I described in monism is rigid monism. They are not complete rigid monists, because they believe, when we talk about Brahman Atman, we're going to see that Atman is sort of a spark out of the Brahman. It's an individualistic spark that is in each person that makes us apparently different, but essentially the same. It provides an individualistic appearance, but that Atman that is within every person is that spark of Brahman, is that spark of the one being that we're supposed to try to find. So that's what it sort of explains that this way they don't have to completely rely on that faulty argument. They can sort of break away from it and say, well, yeah, we believe there is differences, there is individuals, but in essence, we're still all part of that one being. And it is the Atman in each person that makes them apparently different, but essentially the same, because that Atman is still part of the one being, the Brahman. You know?
They do believe the gods are real.
Yeah, they believe that they're real.
330 million gods. Maybe that they're spiritual beings.
Some of them are spiritual beings, some of them were people. Like eventually Krishna, the man, the chariot driver, he is now a god. You know, because he was an avatar of Vishnu. but is actually now a god in his own right. So, but the Bhakti form of Hinduism has become sort of at the heart of the contemporary Hinduism. And within Bhakti Hinduism, we have three main schools. Okay? And they're based on, in Bhakti Hinduism, we have three primary gods. We have Brahma, who is the creator. And again, good luck in trying to reconcile all this stuff, because that's the problem with Hinduism, is it has become so complex. It has become so, because its arms are so wide open to any idea and thought, that it gets very convoluted, it gets very confusing. Especially with the names, because Brahma looks like Brahman, but Brahma is still a god who is part of Brahman, but he is the creator part of Brahman. He is the god that is part of Brahman that is the creator. And then we have Vishnu, who is a preserver, and Shiva, who is a destroyer, but not in an evil sense. He's a destroyer of evil and a recreator.
So they do believe in origin then?
Well, they believe, we're going to see, they sort of believe that that creation goes through cycles. That creation goes through these things called yugas, which is very long periods of time, 4 to 8 billion years long, that basically the universe, it's almost like, I forget what they call it in cosmology and astronomy, like where the universe grows and then shrinks and grows and shrinks. They kind of believe that principle, that everything becomes created, grows, and then falls back on itself, and everything merges back together again, and then expands again. And
so they don't actually address origin?
Not in that sense. Everything is eternal. The universe is eternal.
Okay.
But it goes into, it shrinks into, I don't want to say nothingness, but everything sort of reverts back to Brahman, to the one being. And there's no more Atman individualism out there anymore. It's all just, one. It's like we're going to find out what the ultimate goal in Hinduism is, to merge with Brahman, and then liken unto a raindrop that falls into an ocean. The raindrop is falling and it has a sort of a distinct difference. When that raindrop falls into the ocean, how are you going to find that raindrop again? It's gone. It's merged into things. So that's kind of how they see, the end of things. But because of these three gods, we have the three major denominations in Bhakti Hinduism, which is Shaivism, named after Shiva, tradition with multiple expressions. Again, everything gets broken because everybody can go off on an offshoot, and that's perfectly fine. You can take your Hinduism anywhere you want to, but they look at Shiva as a primary god. They primarily would worship Shiva. And it is more theistic than impersonalistic, if that's a word. Then there's Vaishnavism, which again emphasizes the worship of Vishnu, understands Brahman in terms of more personal manifestations, Ram, Krishna, Vishnu has multiple avatars, and Krishna is one of them. So you could spend your whole life that's why you could spend your whole life just worshiping Vishnu and examining all the different avatars within Vishnu and all the different gods within Vishnu, the avatars, and because again with Bhakti it's about devotion, picking your god and then being devoted to that god. And then Shaktism is this: every one of the Hindu gods has they're primarily masculine. But each one of them has a wife or a Shakti. So those that sort of adhere to the Shakti form of Bhakti Hinduism, they're devoting themselves sort of to the feminine side of the deities, the Divine Mother, if you will, as the ultimate expression of the Godhead. So they just sort of see the female side of Brahman, if you will, as the ultimate expression. Key teachings. Originally polytheistic. When the Aryans first came in, they brought in a polytheistic approach to things, but that sort of evolved and became more of a pantheistic philosophy when it merged with that monism. All is God, all is divine, and the divine is everything. But some forms of Hindu teachings and Hindu schools teach forms of theism. So again, that's why it's very tough to nail Hinduism down, because it's all over the map. For the non-theists, those within Hinduism that are non-theists, God is impersonal and thus not a personal creator. God therefore is not distinct from his creation, but in various ways part of it. Both creature and its source is part of the big reality called Brahman Atman. For example, here's a quote from the Rig Vedas. They call it Indra, Mitra, Varuna, and Agni, and also the heavenly beautiful Garutman. The real is one, though sages name it variously. Interestingly, to bring our old friend John Hick back, he took that phrase from the Rig Vedas and just sort of rephrased it in his own way, because being pluralistic, he said they call it Yahweh, Allah, Krishna, Param Atma, and also Holy Blessed Trinity. The real is one, though the sages name it differently. So just borrowing a line from the Rig Veda, he wanted to bolster his own position of plurality. In short, Brahman is the divine totality. It is that one being that exists. Okay, the ultimate reality. Remember what John Hick called it? The noumena? Remember the noumena? That ultimate reality, that thing that is. And it's just, in Hinduism, that thing that is really all there is. There is only one, I think back to the monistic mentality. There is only one being in the whole universe. And the universe is part of that being. So the Brahman is the ultimate reality, is that one being. The Atman is the divided soul. It is a spark from the fire of Brahman. Indian guru Muktananda said, worship your inner self. God lives within you as you. So that Atman is like in you. That is the part of Brahman that is within you. That is your essence. And the whole point of Hinduism is you just have to find, the God. You have to find the Atman within you so that you can merge with Brahman.
So there's an Atman within you, but at the same time you are Brahman.
Well, that Atman is who you are.
Right.
All this other stuff is an illusion. Your individual personality, your sense of humor, whatever you want to call it, your physical being, all that is all illusion. The real you is the Atman that is in there. You're God. You just forgot it.
But if that's the case, shouldn't it all be the same? Like, why is there a distinction even between Brahman and Atman?
Because
everything is...
Well, again, because they have to sort of justify that if there is one being, yet we are different. How is that? Because that one being, that Brahman, who is the one being that exists, has put I don't want to say has put, because Brahman is not even a conscious being, so to speak. The Atman is that piece of Brahman that is within us. It is what makes us what connects us to Brahman.
It
Again,
connects us to
I'm
Brahman.
not going to be very successful in trying
it connects
to
us to
defend
Brahman.
Hinduism because I think it's indefensible.
Yet we are Brahman.
Yeah, exactly. Well, because the Atman is within us.
Okay.
You know. So Brahman is God, conceptualized in an impersonal, all-pervasive being. Brahman is actually all there is. There's your monism. Everything else that is not Brahman is called Maya, or play, illusion. We live in ignorance to our own divinity. And the connection to Brahman is the Atman. See, all this other stuff is what they call Maya. It's illusion, it's play. It's not part of Atman. It's not real. The only thing that's real is Atman within you, which is, or the Brahman within you, which they call Atman. And your whole goal is to find that Atman, to find the God that is within you. So, and we live in ignorance to our own divinity. Now, a very important part of Hindu philosophy is the caste system. Very controversial. 4 major castes. They're mentioned in the Vedas, and they're elaborated in the laws of Manu. They are inflexible, and that means you cannot ignore the castes. You cannot step outside your caste. We see a similar analogy in Europe, particularly in medieval Europe. We had the lords, we had the vassals, we had the serfs. You had your class, and we even see it really even carried over in Great Britain. What's that show? Downton Abbey, where you have the owners of the property, and then you have the servants. And it was in England, even if you weren't wealthy at all, you had servants, because well, what are the servants going to do? The servants have to live, they have to survive somehow. Even if all they do is just you provide them with food, they would still be your maid or whatever. Even if you were not, now if you were really super poor, but even if you were like lower middle class, you still had servants, because everybody needs to be in their place. In England, no, it's not as rigid, because some people would step out and it would be very socially unacceptable. But in Hinduism, to step outside your caste is forbidden. It is not done. It is inflexible. If you were born to a caste, that's what you are. And your whole point is you need to move up the caste system. You have the Brahmin, which are the priests. That's the highest caste there is. You have the Kshatriyas, which originally were the warriors, but now that we sort of live in a relatively peaceful world, if you will, or at least they're not out fighting battles anymore, that has sort of become the political people, the politicians, the rulers, the governors, and those are the Kshatriyas. Then the Vaishyas, which are the merchants, the owners, the business people, and the lowest class, the lowest caste, is the Shudras. These are the workers. They exist only to serve the other castes. That's their only reason for existing. Within the Shudras, there are numerous subcastes, the lowest of those being the Dalits. The Dalits are the untouchables. We've heard Pastor Bill talk about those before. These are basically, they're not considered human. They're the lowest of the low. And it's okay. And if you ever go on YouTube and put in Dalit, you're going to be shocked at what you see. You're going to see people being beaten for no reason, because they're just Dalits. And this is one of the problems with this. When we get into karma and reincarnation, is if you have been born to the Shudra caste, and you're poor, you are starving, it would be cruel for somebody in one of the they're called twice born, the first 3 castes, the more superior castes. If somebody was in one of these three castes, it would be unkind for them to help you. Because the whole point is you're in this lower caste. If you're a Shudra, you're there because karma has placed you there. And you need to shake off that karma. You need to live the existence of a Shudra to shake off the karma. If they come in and help you, then then you're not releasing the karma. And you will have to be reincarnated and come back as a Shudra again. That's why there's so much poverty in India. They just let them, don't help them. If you help them, they'll come back in the next life in the same way. See, when you follow these things through to the end, it really becomes cruel. And this is, recently they have, they have not let go of the caste system, but they have not been as cruel as they once were. Gandhi was a big part of that because Gandhi was not a strong proponent of, he supported the caste system, but not the treatment that was given to the Shudras. You have a question?
Where do the civic leaders fit in there?
That'd be the Kshatriyas, the warriors. They used to be the warriors, now they're more like the civic leaders, the politicians, the governors, and things like that. So life and salvation, here's the thing. All souls in time will merge with Brahman. Following multiple reincarnations, even thousands of reincarnations. Reincarnation is not found in the Vedas. It is something that had to be created to explain the purpose of the caste system that was found in the Vedas. Okay? These life cycles are called samsara, or wanderings. Okay? Being liberated and merging with Brahman is not heavenly bliss, like we see in theism. The human soul's final release from suffering and the cycles of reincarnation occurs when the soul dissolves into Brahman, the universe, like a raindrop falling in the ocean. This is called moksha. And it amounts basically to the extinction of the individual personality. There's really no more you. It's essentially annihilationism. Okay? This is at the essence of their belief system. And we have carried reincarnation over into the Western world as, oh, that's cool. I used to be George Patton in another life. I used to be General Washington, or I was, whoever. Shirley MacLaine, talking about all, it's amazing that, when these people remember their former lives, they're always generals or politicians or great kings. Nobody was a shoemaker. Nobody was a poverty-stricken serf. They're all amazing kings and famous people.
Are they the ones that believe souls go into the cows?
Well,
is that part of
the cow is considered, we're going to get into that when we talk about what's called ahisma, which is they don't believe in harming anything. But the cows are among the highest in the caste system, believe it or not, because it's not just animals that are in the caste system. They believe that they're holy, that they're actually part of the Brahmin, the Brahmin caste. So that's why they call it the sacred cow. They're not allowed to, and the irony is that the people are starving in India, and there's cows everywhere.
Yeah.
We
don't believe in harming anything except the slaves.
Yeah, right. Because it's the caste system. It depends on where you fall. But this idea of reincarnation in Hinduism, it is brutal. It's not something they enjoy. It's not something that they say, oh, I can't wait to come back in my next life, or I was reincarnation. They call it samsara, the wandering. Like you're just doing just that. You're wandering. You're aimlessly, depending on karma. And I think it was Crystal in the comments who said something like, "How does karma know? If there's no consciousness, if this being is an impersonal, unknowing, unknowable, force of energy, and karma is an extension of that. How does karma know? How does karma know how to fix it? How to make things right? You know, there would have to be a consciousness that would direct the soul to the right place, you know, according to karma. But like I said, in the West, they romanticize reincarnation, but the original form of reincarnation in Hinduism is a brutal torture. They call it the wheel. They just want to get off the wheel, you know. And the sad thing is that, like, they look at it like we're stuck on this wheel, or, you know, it's like being on the Ferris wheel. And it never stops, and you're trying to find a way to get off. And then finally, when you get off, you just dissolve into nothingness. You're like a raindrop in the ocean, gone. You know, you're in your essence, you're not gone. I mean, you know, in their philosophy, in your essence, you're not gone, but in your individuality, you're gone, because whatever just like the drop of rainwater that falls into the ocean, well, the actual molecules are still there somewhere, but they're indistinguishable from anything else, and that's the whole point of you merging with Brahman. You're essentially still there, but you're indistinguishable from Brahman. And the history is viewed in terms of these vast cycles of creation and destruction, including what's called the 4 eras. And there are 4 eras within each yuga. Well, there are 4 yugas within these cycles. And you go through these 4 yugas, and then you start the cycle all over again. And that's the whole point, is that eventually everybody sort of gets back into Brahman. Everybody goes back in the ocean. And then it recreates again. And the Atman, the spark, flies out again, and creation begins, and we start this whole cycle, and we start the cycles of reincarnation. And as the cycles of reincarnation continue, and karma starts straightening everything out, and getting everybody back to where they're supposed to be, then we're back in the ocean again. And then it starts up, and it's like these cycles.
I don't imagine there's any scientific evidence for that.
This is fideism. This is what we believe. Here's a Hindu monastery and a Himalayan academy. This is what they say. Our beliefs determine our thoughts and attitudes about life. By our actions, we create our destiny. Beliefs about sacred matters, God, soul, and cosmos are essential to one's approach to life. Hindus believe many diverse things, but there are a few bedrock concepts in which most Hindus concur. The following 9 beliefs, though not exhaustive, again, gotta leave the door open, offer a simple summary of Hindu spirituality. So here's 9 points to Hinduism. Hindus believe, and some of this is going to be just sort of a summary. Hindus believe in a one all-pervasive supreme being who is both immanent and transcendent, both creator and unmanifest reality. Hindus believe in the divinity of the 4 Vedas, the world's most ancient scripture. Again, they have no proof that the Vedas are the world's most ancient scripture, but that's not going to keep them from saying it. And venerate the agamas, which are other writings, as equally revealed. These primordial hymns, which are the agamas, they're like hymns, are God's word and the bedrock of Sanatana Dharma, which is just, if you're Hindu, that's what you call Hinduism. The eternal religion, the Sanatana Dharma. We call it Hinduism, they call it the eternal religion. You know, the one religion. It's the eternal religion because it keeps going back and starting over again. And Hindus believe the universe undergoes endless cycles of creation, preservation, and dissolution. Hindus believe in karma, the law of cause and effect by which each individual creates his own destiny by his thoughts, words, and deeds. You know, that if you do bad things, if you're doing the wrong things you shouldn't be doing, karma is there. You know, and karma, it's like, we use the phrase, oh, that's good karma. Well, there's no such thing as good and bad karma in Hinduism. Karma essentially is just, karma is essentially not good. Karma is the thing that comes to get you. You know, it's the thing that makes you pay for the wrong things that you've done. You know?
There was a good point in Kingdom of the Cults that was talking about karma, and it said this is people think like this is similar to Christianity, and it's really not at all. Because in Christianity, you could never, and I put it this way in the book, something like this, you could never atone for your own sin in 1,000 lifetimes.
Yeah.
And
Well,
that's what this is saying, you can atone for your
Yeah,
sin.
exactly. And people like to say, well, you find it in the Bible, it's the law of sowing and reaping. It really isn't. It really is not the law of sowing and reaping, because again, this is talking about atonement. This is talking about achieving salvation. The law of sowing and reaping is about sanctification. It's about when we do things against God, that there is natural consequences, and then there's also divine consequences. God is not punishing us, but as a loving Father will bring in consequences to guide us and lead us into sanctification, to being more like Him. It has nothing to do with atonement. It has nothing to do with total redemption. That takes place after redemption. In this, it is talking about atonement. It's talking about how do you achieve, you know, the what they would call liberation is by cleaning up your karma, by shaking off the karma and moving yourself up the line. The Hindus believe the soul reincarnates, evolving through many births until all karmas have been resolved, and moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth, is attained. Not a single soul will be deprived of this destiny. So it's universalism, ultimately. Everyone's going to get there eventually. Somehow that karma will work everything out, so everybody eventually gets there.
So you said they moved from a works focus up through a devotion focus, but ultimately based on what they believe, don't they still have to have works to
Well, it still works. But it's less about ritualism. The way of works was more about ritual and ceremony. You know, then the way of knowledge was about attaining an understanding of the universe. And the way of devotion was about having a personal interaction. I even hesitate to say relationship, but somehow of a personal connection or attachment to Brahman, which you can't because Brahman is impersonal, so you have to pick an avatar. You have to pick a sub-god, if you will, a representative, a holy, you know, someone who has attained a high level in Brahman so that you can make a connection with them. So, but it's still all works-based. Yeah, it's just, you know, sometimes before it was about ritual and ceremony, now it's more about devotion and just piety, if you will. Hindus believe that divine beings exist in unseen worlds, and that temple worship, ritual, sacraments, and personal devotions create communion with these devas and gods. This is just like you were saying, Tony. Hindus believe that an enlightened master, or Satguru, is essential to know the transcendent absolute. And again, these are all things from that Kauai Hindu monastery that they're saying. Okay? Personal discipline, good conduct, purification, pilgrimage, self-inquiry, meditation, and surrender to God. That you have to find a Sadguru to help you do this. Hindus believe that all life is sacred to be loved and revered, and therefore practice ahisma, which is non-injury in thought, word, and deed. And we're going to see this sort of carried out to a greater degree when we get to the Jainists. Hindus believe that no religion teaches the only way to salvation above all others, but that all genuine paths are facets of God's light, deserving tolerance and understanding. So, on top of all this very elaborate and complex system of understanding things, they're saying basically you can plug anything you have, anything that you're standing in right now, you can plug that right into this, and that's okay. Because you're just another way of living out what we're already saying. You know, and that's the pantheistic side of it and the pluralistic side of it.
Even Satanism.
If that's your thing, and that's what makes it, you know, that's what makes it not logical.
Yeah.
It's because there are some belief systems that are essentially evil and are all about doing evil things. So how can that mesh with working out the karma, you know? Hare Krishna, we call them Hare Krishna, they call themselves the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. ISKCON. This is actually not a cult, per se. It is actually, I mean, we think of it as a cult because we, you know, you may not remember this, but, you know, we remember in the airports, in the robes with the tambourines, you know, this was, you know, back in the 70s. They were real big in the 60s, but in the 70s and then lingering into the 80s, you would see them with the tambourines, Krishna, Krishna, Hare Hare, you know, they'd be up there chanting, so they look like a cult. But they're actually a legitimate form of Vaishnavite Bhakti Hinduism.
This is what the Beatles went.
What's that?
The Beatles, remember when they had that era when they went to India and...
Was it Hare
I
Krishna?
don't know.
Yeah, well, George Harrison, I think George Harrison. Yeah, he did, yes he did. My Sweet Lord.
Yeah.
Hare Hare, yeah, George Harrison. Or at least adhered to it. I don't know if he ever became a Hare Krishna or an ISKCON. Around the 16th century AD, a man, Caetana, a teacher, proclaimed that Krishna was the highest godhead, and that Krishna was the chariot driver for the warrior, and he was an avatar of Vishnu. But he claims that now Krishna has now attained godhead in his own right, and he is actually the highest godhead. He's the 9th avatar of Vishnu. Became very popular in the 1960s. 5 essential teachings in Hare Krishna, in ISKCON. Krishna is supreme form, the personal God, essentially monotheistic, but that's okay in Hinduism. That's not a problem. You can be monotheistic and still be Hindu. Salvation is obtained, there's a little spell check problem there, by continually chanting Hare Krishna, which just means praise to Krishna, up to 1,000 times a day. That's why they would do that. That's why they would be singing this song, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare. That's why we call them Hare Krishna. It's all they would do, is all day long, is just be saying they got to do it 1,000 times a day.
Wow.
The Bhagavad Gita is their inspired scripture, along with the Vedas, but they see the Bhagavad Gita as superior. They live a life of pure devotion to Krishna, abstaining from meat, caffeine, sweets, and sex for pleasure. And also, the last point is distribution of literature that disseminates message of Krishna consciousness. They're always handing out their pamphlets,
Yes.
right? That's their devotion. You know, it's not even like they're trying to sell something. You know, although they do, they always sell the flowers and they're trying to raise money for their movement. But that was part of their worship, was to disseminate information about Krishna. So that's the Hare Krishna movement, or the International Society of Krishna Consciousness. Now we're going to move into Zoroastrianism. Okay, 189,000 people worldwide. Not a huge movement, and getting smaller. You'll see why. But I want to cover it because these also came from the Aryans. Remember, the Aryans came down from Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and some went into India, some went into Iran, Persia. The essential belief was that there's 2 kinds of spiritual beings. The Ahuras, which are lords and they're good, as opposed to the Hindus, the Asuras, which are evil, and then the Devas, the shining ones that are evil, as opposed to the Devas in Hinduism, which are good. They have remnant roots in monotheism. Even this idea of Dev once meant a single god. This was what I thought was interesting. Watch the progression of this. There was a single god, and this Dev sort of ended up being this Dios Pater. Actually, it should be Pitar, P-I-T-E-R. Dios Pitar, which means Father God. Well, that sort of translated from Dios Pitar to Zeus Pater, which is Father Zeus, which we have in Greece. Zeus is the head god in Greece. And then you take Zeus pater, and that transliterates in Roman into Jupiter, which Jupiter is the head god in the Roman polytheistic god system. You know, so you know when you, and I remember this when I was actually taking Latin, because a lot of the Latin literature is based on the gods, the Roman gods. That all the Roman gods have Greek counterparts. You know, Venus in Rome was Athena in Greece. Zeus in Greece is Jupiter in Rome, and they all were counterparts. It's basically the same god system, but just different names. So it's just interesting to see how that sort of morphed, even in the language. And it was saying how even this came out of that Indo-European, which was considered one of the first languages, or at least one of the first written languages that they can go back to. We have a lot of our words that still come from, even that word div, divine, divinity. There's still a lot of roots to these things. So this started sort of developing, and in the 6th century was what was called the rise of the Magi. This is the same Magi that we see in the story of Christ. But to that point, at this point in the 6th century BC, they rose to a priestly aristocracy. They were actually like a ruling class. By the time of Christ, the Magi had sort of been relegated to being just astrologers and counselors to the ruling class. But at this time, they were actually a ruling class of people. Zoroaster, or that's the Greek form of his name, his Zarathustra was his Persian name. And this was 628 to 551 BC. He was 30 years old. He had a vision from Ahura Mazda, which means wise Lord. And it's probably no coincidence that somebody named their car company Mazda. because it means wise. Ahura means Lord, and Mazda means wise. He had 6 more visions over the course of 8 years, and his teaching really cut at the livelihood of the priesthood, because it was a departure from ceremony and ritual toward piety. In other words, you don't need the priests in order to be holy. It's not about your devotion to the priesthood. It's not about relying on the priest to do things for you. You know, he was sort of taking this belief in Ahura Mazda, this monotheistic belief, and making it more devotional and personal. You know, he put together a collection of scriptures called the Avesta, which became their holy scripture. Again, it was a return to monotheism. However, you had Ahura Mazda, which was the wise Lord, but you still had the Devas, which are evil spirits. They're not divine, but they were in competition. They were in opposition to Ahura Mazda. And then even Ahura Mazda was divided into 6 attributes. So 3 male and 3 female, or 3 mother and 3 father and 3 mother attributes. But they're called the holy immortals. And they actually, they sort of look at it in the same way that we see the Trinity, that they were actual persons that were part of Ahura Mazda. They were not separate gods. They still were monotheistic. Ahura Mazda is God, but these 6 holy immortals, 3 male, 3 female, made up the one God. The head evil spirit is Angra Mainyu, who seeks to divert people from the commands of Ahura Mazda. This is Zoroaster's teachings. He's not equal to Ahura Mazda, but moral battles in our lives are resolved by who we listen to. In other words, it's like the devil on our shoulders, you know. Are we going to listen to Ahura Mazda, or are we going to listen to Angra Mainyu? And this sort of evolved eventually. The religion as it's practiced today is not anything the way Zoroaster had imagined it or had assembled it, because it sort of has evolved into a dualism that we see these 2 ideologies, a good side and a bad side. And that the struggle is you know, we're being pulled from both directions, and the struggle is to try to divert yourself to the good side. One of the interesting derivations of this is in Star Wars, Force, that you have the dark side of the Force and the good side of the Force. And it's all about, finding your way to the good side. Your deeds are accumulated throughout life. If you support truth, you get rewards on earth and heaven. If you support what they call the lie, which is the evil side, then you receive punishment. Now, in about the 7th century AD, the Muslims conquered Iran, and Zoroastrianism was driven out because Islam, and I didn't mention this last week, but Islam has what we know of as Sharia law, which is the opposite of separation of church and state. Sharia law is, we are a Muslim government and you will be Muslim. And when the Muslims would move into a country and would conquer a country, you had a choice. You can become a Muslim, you can pay a tribute, and we won't leave you, we'll leave you alone. Or you can refuse all of that and we just kill you. So this is what happened in Iran, and Zoroastrianism kind of came to an end, essentially. And most of them were driven out, mostly to Bombay, India, and today they're called Parsis, or Persians, was the word that was used in India. The Parsis, or the Persians, that came to live in India. And that's basically who the Zoroastrians, they don't go by the name Zoroastrians anymore, they're just called Parsis. Again, the teachings of Zoroaster faded and yielded to a polytheistic culture with a Ahura Mazda, or now he's just called Hormazd, is the primary and the highest god. They're very pluralistic and, with regard to other faiths, very inclusive, it's okay, everyone's going to make it into heaven, this is just our view. There's an emphasis on ritual and ceremonial cleansing. Again, they're trying to purge out all the evil, so they wash themselves, they clip their nails and things like that, they have to get rid of it, they can't let their fingernails grow too long, because so an emphasis on ritual cleansing. And their religion is tied to ethnicity. They're Parsis. And Parsis, that is like Jews. This is your religion. This is what you practice. You're Parsi, you practice the Parsi religion, which is Zoroastrianism. They resist outside converts because they consider it to be a contamination of their religion. So, there's not going to be many Zoroastrians left in the world for much longer. They're already at 180-something thousand. And they don't accept converts, so more than likely they're going to become extinct. And they believe the world is going to end in a molten flood, metal flood, but to the righteous, it's going to feel like a bath of warm milk. I just wanted to include that because I thought that was pretty interesting choice of looking at things. I'm like, okay, a bath of warm milk. So that is Zoroastrianism. Jainism. And these last two we're going to try to go through quickly here. We're getting to the end of our time. Jainism, pretty good size. I mean, 4 million, almost 5 million worldwide. When you consider what Judaism is 14 million. I mean, Jainism's got a pretty good following here. Mahavira, his name, he was born Naraputa Vadhamana. His story is similar to Siddhartha Gautama. I know you guys just read about Buddhism last week, so similar story. He was disillusioned with a life of wealth and luxury. This Mahavira, he was born to a wealthy class, a high caste, but he was disillusioned by it, and he ended up forsaking everything for a life of asceticism. Gautama went what's called the middle path, the middle way, where he didn't go into the extreme. Well, Mahariva didn't. He went all the way to the extreme, full asceticism to the point where he didn't wear clothes, no shelter. He avoided harming any living thing, including plant. He would only eat vegetables and only what other people threw away, because he figured, I'm not killing it, I'm not involved in the killing of it. It was just going to be thrown away anyway, so that's okay, because I have to eat something. After 13 years, he achieved enlightenment and understood the universe. He became known as Jina, a conqueror, and those who followed him were called Jainists. Differed from monistic pantheism, believed in many distinct souls. Each soul was a jiva and is distinct and sacred. And this is where he goes into the ascetic end of ahisma. Left alone, this is the belief, left alone, a soul should float like a balloon to the top of a human-shaped universe to exist forever. However, souls have been contaminated and weighed down by karma. Remember, this is an offshoot of Hinduism, but it's not Hinduism because it doesn't hold the Vedas as divine, and it doesn't adhere to the caste system. So it would not be considered Hinduism. But a lot of the same ideas about the karma. And karma is like, he compares it to chunks of dirt, chunks of karma that get stuck in your soul, and it has to be purged out. You have to, living a pure light purges the body from karma matter. The greatest achievement is to starve to death under a tree, because you have completely abandoned everything from yourself and you have no needs at all. It's Hindu, but the gods are only for personal piety, not for enlightenment, almost like went the way of Buddha, where if you want to have a god, that's fine. If having a god, worshiping a god, helps you to live a more pure life, then that's fine, but you don't have to. The essence of Jainism is in 5 vows. Ahisma, no harm to any living thing. Again, this is to the extreme, to where you can only eat what's been thrown away. You can't eat any meat at all, or anything that has anything to do. This is where did my mind go blank? This is beyond vegan. This is vegan, and then you can't even eat a plant, you can't kill plant matter, you can't go out and buy vegetables. You have to take whatever's being thrown away, because this way you're not involved in any way in that plant matter being killed. They wear masks because they're afraid that they might swallow a fly by accident or a mosquito.
What if everybody was converted to their religion?
And everybody would starve to death under a tree. Truth-telling is the second vow. To the point, and truth, nothing wrong with truth-telling, but to the point where they fear contradiction, so they finish every sentence with maybe or somehow, because they're afraid they might be wrong. Accidentally, they might say something that is not entirely true, so they even finish all their sentences with maybe or somehow. Like, they'll leave it open in case I'm wrong, I'm not saying I'm right, you know. Abstaining from theft, again, good. It's a virtuous thing, but again, taken to the nth degree, they won't accept anything that isn't given to them, and they will not own any property. Conquering sexual desire. They actually suppress all carnal desires of any kind, any bodily, again, like hunger, anything like that.
Are they like monks?
Yeah, I mean, that basically, you know, the true followers of Jainism are monks. Because they live a monastic type of life, because the last one is detachment, renouncing everything, family, self, body, even your name. You give up your name and you live a monastic life, just, you know, like the monks. Sikhism, okay, the Sikhs, 19 million worldwide. Bigger than, there's more Sikhs than there are Jews. This was an attempt to create harmony between Islam and Hinduism, fusing them, but not a compromise. They believe that their position to be true in its own right. 16th century AD, India was ruled by Muslim emperors. And relations between the Hindus and the Muslims was volatile at all times. Again, because they're trying to impose Sharia law. They've already taken Iran, they've taken India, and they're trying to impose Sharia law, but the Hindus are very devout, and they don't want to, so there's a lot of volatility in there. A man named Nanak, in about the 16th, end of the 15th, early 16th century, believed that the true God transcends established religious distinctions. He said, look, there's no Muslims, there's no such thing as a Muslim, there's no such thing as a Hindu. He's just trying to make peace. He said, look, forget all this. God is beyond even our understanding or our ability to attach any kind of a name to him or a religious thing to him. And what he did is he dressed in a combination of Muslim and Hindu garments. These are the guys you see that wear turbans, but they usually wear very elaborate turbans that sort of come to a point, like this. And sometimes you see they might have a jewel there or something. You'll see them, often.
Maybe an Aladdin?
What's that?
Aladdin?
Yeah, like an Aladdin, but like what I'm thinking of, so the fortune tellers, those guys. And you'll see them at the 7-Eleven, but they usually wear that very elaborate turban, very dressy turban, and they have very long hair. They let their hair grow, even from a child, their hair it's all wrapped up in that turban. Their hair will be down to their heels. They never cut their hair. They just let it grow, and then it's all wrapped up in that turban. That turban is not so, because you'll see it's like a big, huge turban on their head, but it's all hair. It's not all turban. It's not some big, filled with thing. It's hair. When Nanak died, they didn't know how to bury him, because they said, well, do we bury him as a Hindu or do we bury him as a Muslim? So they left his body out overnight, and when they came back, they said he vanished. So they felt that it was miraculous and he was somehow divine, or at least enlightened. So it added to the following. They believe in one God, but he's known by different names, but he's not personal. God's identity is beyond characterization imposed by man. And you're going to see it. So it's sort of got this flavor of Islam. It's monotheistic, and God is unknowable and not personal. But we're not going to give him a name. They believe in karma, reincarnation, and moksha. The whole cycle and everything, and dissolution. And their emphasis is on devotion to God, but not rituals. Okay? They believe that there were a succession of 10 gurus that taught Sikhism. And that they were embodied by God to teach the divine, to teach divine truth. The 10th guru said, I'm the last guru, and presented the Adi Granth, which is their holy book, and said, this is the final guru. There'll be no more gurus after me. The book will be the final guru. And so that's how they live. They live by the Adi Granth. They, in addition to the Hindus, were persecuted by Muslims, but they learned to do battle and defend themselves against the Muslims and protect their own existence. But at this time now, the British come in and take over India and drive out the Muslims and actually end up fighting with the Sikhs. But the Sikhs, and they defeated the Sikhs, but the Sikhs were such great warriors that once the British took over, they actually enlisted and recruited the Sikhs to become sort of like the local constabulary, the local police, because India had still retained its Hindu culture and its Hindu, even with all the fighting with the Muslims, they still had retained their Hindu culture and their Hindu religion. And the Sikhs were a minority there, but the British sort of recruited them to become sort of their police force, their local forces in the area, and guards and things like that, so that they wouldn't have to bring as many British over to India, and they helped them keep control and govern in India. All right, any questions? I know we covered a lot of stuff, especially the last ones we went through quick.
Like I say, it's random Christian.
Yeah.
It's too,
And, and that's, amen to that.
yeah.
Because, I think of how the Hindus sort of, how do they, from day to day, what do they believe? What do they worship? Because no matter what it is, it's like, it's okay, bring it in, include it. There's a quote from Ravi Zacharias one time. He was actually quoting who was at the time, the highest level priest in Hinduism. And the man said, he says, I feel like our arms are open too wide. That if we keep including more and more realities into Hinduism, that it's going to mean nothing. Because if everything is true, then nothing is true. If you include everything in, then you cease to exist. It's kind of like, they're fulfilling their own prophecy. They're becoming like that drop in the water. If the arms are so open wide that everything that anybody believes can be incorporated into it, then you don't believe anything, really. You have no real belief system other than beliefism. That you believe something, and it just becomes, it's like a thread. Eventually, you start pulling on that thread, and things are going to start falling apart because there's no structure, there's no basis in truth to the whole system, And like you said, is there any scientific evidence for any of this? No, of course not. There's no. It's just what they believe, and they can keep adding to it and elaborating on it and making it more complex. And it's unfortunate. I mean, the struggle is when you are sharing the gospel with somebody who is Hindu, or really any of these. They'll just sit there and smile and nod and say, that's wonderful, that's very interesting, thank you for sharing that with me. That's a wonderful system that you have.
No concept of logic whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, no concept of the problem is there's no concept of of the law of non-contradictions.
Right.
No concept of, hey, look, when I'm sharing this with you, I'm essentially telling you this is truth. And they don't even understand that concept, that okay, it's truth, yeah, just like my truth, and his truth, and her truth.
What kind of consequences does a worldview that doesn't have truth play out in the real world?
Well, I think eventually it's like that thread. You just keep pulling on it, and it has to come apart. It just has to. Because it's just, although we in the world system, this is the direction that we're going. Because it's this idea of tolerance. Look, everybody in the pool. It's okay. All right, let's just, don't bother me with logic. Don't bother me with concepts of things, of how things are supposed to work and how things make sense. We just want to get along. We want everybody in the pool because it doesn't really matter what you believe. Because none of it's probably true anyway, or all of it's true, or who knows, and we don't really, sort of we get into that, that noumena phenomena thing again, where, well, I'm sure there's something that's true out there somewhere, but we don't really know what it is. So we're all just going to do our own phenomena here, and play our little game, and hope that it gets us into whatever it is that we hope to get into. So it is, it's like you just, you keep pulling on that thread and it falls apart. The problem is we live in a postmodern world where nobody cares if it falls apart. They don't look at it. They're not pulling on that thread. They go, just leave the thread alone. We probably agree that if you pull on the thread, it'll fall apart, so leave the thread alone. Let's just live in our delusion, live in our illusion, and pray that it all works out. That's kind of where society is headed. So, okay. We'll catch you next week.